I was recommended and asked by Edward Said to give this talk. And the last time I met him in June, he warned me many times that I cannot miss this and I must do it. So I feel happy that I am fulfilling his wish, one of his wishes. And we have agreed that at that meeting that after this lecture I will do some kind of a quick tour to speak to different Palestinians, Palestinian community, and Arabs and Americans about the Palestinian National Initiative, the new movement we are creating. And unfortunately, we cannot do it together. And I miss him a lot, as I'm sure many of you do. But I am going to do it. I'm going to do it this week because I think by doing that, I will be precisely doing what he wanted us to do. We have to continue the path. We have to continue what he wished for. And we have to make this Palestinian National Initiative a truly strong democratic movement that works for peace, for democracy, and for the goodwill of the Palestinian people who have suffered so much and who deserve finally to have freedom and justice. I want to say that Edward Said did not get to support and advocate the Palestinian cause because he was a nationalist. No. He got to support the Palestinian cause because he was a person that believed in human values and justice, and him to understand and advocate the Palestinian cause because he saw in it a great amount of injustice that was made to the people. And I think that people like him and like Eqbal Ahmad, whom we miss a lot, will never disappear. Those two wonderful people that have left so much impact will never disappear because they have left us, but they stayed with us, in my opinion. Because people like Eqbal Ahmad and like Edward Said did not really represent the past. They simply represented the future. And a future, we have a duty, all of us, we have a duty to reach. A future, we have a duty to achieve. So, as I said, it's a great honor for me to be with you today and to be giving this talk. And I will speak about 3 issues. First of all, I find myself obliged to present to you the reality of the situation in Palestine and in the occupied territories before I speak about the vision for the future. Why do I have to do that? Because simply, I think there is so much misrepresentation about the reality, and there is so much bias in the press that the people of the United States who are entitled to know the truth, entitled to know the facts, the objective facts, do not have that opportunity, unfortunately. And I think any person can take any stand he likes. He could be a supporter of Palestine, or she could be a supporter of Israel, or they could be a supporter of both sides, but everybody is entitled to knowing the reality and the truth, because this is a right. And that's why I have to make some presentation about the reality on the ground. And when I make it, I hope you will notice how much there is of a blackout about the reality in Palestine. Then I will talk about some myths that have prevailed and that unfortunately can prevent us from reaching a solution to this long-standing conflict. And finally, I will present a vision that I think the whole of civil society in Palestine, all the democratic forces in Palestine share as an opening to the future. So let me begin by presenting some of the facts on the ground, and I would start with just reminding you with some historical perspectives. As you remember, in 1947, a decision was made to establish two states on the land of Palestine. A Jewish state on the blue area on the map, which would be on around 55% of the historic Palestine, and a Palestinian state over 45% of the land of historic Palestine, which is drawn in red here. In 1948, Israel was established. 700,000 Palestinians were dismissed, forced to leave their homeland, becoming the Palestinian refugees. And Israel was established not over 55% of the land, but over 78% of historic Palestine. What remained was West Bank and Gaza Strip, which were occupied by Israel in 1967. This is the history. Now, in 1988, Palestinians came to terms with the fact that they have to make a compromise to achieve peace. And that compromise was the establishment of a Palestinian state, a two-state solution, as was proposed, in which case Palestinians have accepted, regardless of the fact that they felt that this was not just. They've accepted to have a Palestinian state over 22% of the land of Palestine in West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, thinking that if they have reached to this compromise, probably it will be accepted. They were encouraged so much by so many mediators, just have to accept that. And to our surprise, we discovered that actually this was not the case, since what we witnessed was a creation of so many Israeli illegal settlements over the land of the West Bank, and practically spreading them all over the area. And it didn't matter whether the governing party in this case was Labor or Likud, all of them participated in building these settlements, which you can see as red spots on the map. And then comes the idea of Sharon of a Palestinian state, where he would want to annex practically 58% of the land of the West Bank, leaving only these green spots to become what he calls a Palestinian state. Now, this would bring down the percentage to 9%. You could look at this map and say, okay, what are these? Is this a state really? Is this something that could be contiguous, that could be viable? You can call them anything, but I don't think you can call them a state. You can call them pantostans, maybe. Maybe you can call them ghettos, but they are definitely do not represent a state. So this is the story. Started from 45% in 47 to 22% in 67, and now we get this map which is proposing a state in these little spots. I think there are four processes that have been happening on the ground during the last few years that have been ignored by the international community. And these four processes are determining the facts on the ground. While we were engaging in the so-called peace process, and while Oslo was signed, and while we were thinking that we've achieved a point of no return towards peace, four processes started to happen on the ground. And the first one is full reoccupation. Practically since April 2002, Israel reoccupied completely the West Bank and almost 60% of Gaza Strip. Siege and closure is the second act. Ferocious expansion of settlements, Israeli illegal settlements in the West Bank. And we are talking here about an expansion that exceeded 150% in size and population since 1993, and the creation of 102 new settlements since then as well. Additionally, there is the construction of the new wall, a wall that we call apartheid wall, because it is really creating an apartheid system. One of the examples of the suffering that is happening to the Palestinians during the last 3 years of the uprising is the huge number of casualties that have been caused by the occupying army. And when I mention here the number of Palestinian casualties, I'm not ignoring the fact that 900 Israelis have also been killed. And I believe that those 3,500 people, Palestinians and Israelis, who have been killed should not have died. Both the Palestinians and Israelis were victims of occupation, victims of a wrong policy of occupation. And that's how they have to be looked at. During the last 3 years of the uprising, Palestinians have lost 2,680 people who were shot by the Israeli army. 20% of them were children. 60% of them were shot with live ammunition. 85% of them were civilians who were not involved in any kind of combat, whether military or even peaceful demonstrations. This is a huge number for a small population like the Palestinian population living in West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem. We're talking only about 3.6 million people. Had we have the population of the United States, this number would have been 222,000 people killed over a period of 3 years. And the number of injuries would have been almost 4 million people injured. Imagine if 222,000 Americans were killed, what would be the reaction? Imagine if 4 million people would have been injured in 3 years, what would be the reaction of the American community? It is too much of a price. And unfortunately, the distribution of the death across the ages is, first of all, there is a lot of people who are young who are killed, mostly young people are killed, but also adults and elderly people are killed. We have about 6% of those who were killed who were above the age of 50 or 60, killed in their homes, in the streets, in the markets. And of course, the most painful thing is what happens to children. 496 children so far have been killed. Some of them, like Dunya Matar on the right side of this slide, who was 3 months old, was shot in her home during an Israeli bombardment. The same applies to Ayman Faris. And out of 47,000 who were injured, 2,500 have become permanently disabled. This is equal to almost 200,000 people had we have the population of the United States. 500 of those disabled were children, and some of them had terrible things, like the case of these children on the right side of the slide who lost their eyes. We have 100 children, Palestinian children, who lost their eyes because of the so-called rubber bullets. And when they speak about rubber bullets, you would think this is not a lethal weapon. You would think it's something that is harmless. Actually, it's not. It's very dangerous. These are not, I will show you the bullets later, but these are not rubber bullets. These are metallic shards, heavy metallic shards covered with a very thin piece of rubber. And when they penetrate the skull of a person, like has happened in the case of this boy, they can cause great damage to the brain. And we call them the nightmare of the neurosurgeon, because once they penetrate the skull, they are there inside. The surgeon cannot remove them, because if they try to do so, they would end up damaging a huge amount of the brain tissue, killing the patient. And if they leave them, most of the time, that will be also a sentence to death, because each time the patient moves his head, they would move and causing more damage to the brain tissue. These are the lightest form of weapons that are used against the Palestinians in the occupied territories. We have F-16 jet fighters, Apache helicopters, tanks, and of course live ammunition used all the time and causing all these injuries. We found out that more than 90% of those who were killed were shot in the upper part of the body, which means they were shot to be killed. And I can go on speaking about that for a long time and show you so many pictures. But I think the most important issue here is to ask, what is behind this policy? The same question would be asked about the policy of assassination, a policy that is condemned everywhere in the world. Assassination is extrajudicial execution that is considered a straightforward violation of human rights and of all kinds of agreements that control the behavior, even in wars. And an assassination is simply an act where the Israeli general or minister or prime minister makes of himself the prosecutor, the judge, and the executor at the same time. And the outcome of this policy is obvious. Out of 292 Palestinians who were assassinated, 142, almost 50% were bystanders, civilians that were not even targeted. 33 of them were children, 25 of them were women. And the question is, why is this policy continue to happen? Especially that assassination in particular was the main instrument that was used by several governments to break the ceasefire that we managed to achieve several times up till now. 3 times we managed to pressure Hamas and Jihad to stop committing attacks. 3 times we had ceasefires. 3 times the ceasefire was violated by Sharon. 3 times with assassination policy. And detention and arrest is another sign of the existing problem. Up till now, we had 28,000 people arrested since March 2002. 5,330 remain in jail. 650 are under administrative detention. Administrative detention means you can put people in jail without charges, just because you suspect that they might be doing something wrong. We had people in jail under administrative detention without charges for 6 years. 6 years without charges. And what worries most is not only the fact that 360 of those were children, but the fact that since the beginning of occupation in 1967, Israel has conducted 650,000 arrests. That means, considering that most of those were male population, that means almost 40% of the total male population in the occupied territories have been to jail. Of course, that leaves a very serious impact. The second process that is happening on the ground is what we call siege and closure. This map shows you half of the checkpoints that are imposed in the occupied territories. I couldn't put all these checkpoints on the map because then the map would look completely red. We're talking about 482 checkpoints cutting the country into clusters of presence. We're talking about 300 clusters, basically, preventing the normal possibility of movement from one area to the other. And the outcome is, of course, I don't know how to use this, sorry. The outcome is that what you see here is that if people are unable to travel from one area to the other, I always give the example of a colleague of mine who works with us here in Ramallah, and his family lives somewhere near Hebron in a village called Sa'ir. The trip from here to there is only 45 kilometers. It would take him usually 45 minutes, 50 minutes to get there. During the last 2.5 years, he either cannot go to see his family because the checkpoints are closed, or they would be open, in which case he can travel, but it would take him, instead of 45 minutes, 9 hours, and he has to change the car 11 times. Because since 2.5 years, we are forbidden, the whole Palestinian population of the West Bank is forbidden from using cars, streets, totally. We do not have the luxury of driving a car from one city to another, from one village to a city. And you can imagine what kind of damage that can cause to economy, to education, to health facilities. We do not have any more students capable of coming from Gaza, for instance, or Jenin to study in Birzeit University. We're talking about a small country, and yet they cannot do that. We do not have anymore the possibility of students coming from Hebron to study in Najah University in Nablus. It's a very difficult situation, and I believe it has nothing to do with security. It's an act of collective punishment. These checkpoints have become a place where humiliation and violence is practiced widely against the population, as you can see on these slides. An outcome of that, of course, is prevention of medical care. 82 people have already died because they couldn't get to medical treatment. One of them was a patient of mine. Her name was Aisha. She was 21 years old. She had kidney problems. She needed kidney dialysis 3 times a week. And one day, there was a checkpoint in front of their village. Her father, for a whole week, pleaded with the army to let her pass. They wouldn't let her pass. And at the end of the week, when she got very sick and couldn't pass, they called us, and we sent an ambulance to pick her up at 12 midnight. They wouldn't let the ambulance pass. And she died at home. She died at home. This person, like so many others, did not have to die. She has nothing to do with anything. She was not politically active. She was not involved in anything. She was simply a person who was sick and who needed treatment and could not get it. The same applies to many, many people. We have, as I said, terrible humiliation happening at these checkpoints. I cannot describe to you how painful it is. I've been myself through these checkpoints, and I cannot describe to you what kind of anger people have when they have to stand in lines for hours just trying to get home. During the last days, we had to organize voluntary teams to go to these checkpoints to give people water because they are usually fasting. It's Ramadan. And the time would come to break their fast when they are standing at checkpoints and they have nothing there. It's a terrible situation. People are sometimes ordered to take off their clothes completely, like in the case of this guy. He was lucky because he was allowed to keep his underwear and undershirt. There were other occasions when people were undressed completely. And carrying even the patients from one area to the other is a difficult matter. There are checkpoints where the distance between one side and the other is at least 2 kilometers, and not even an ambulance is allowed to cross that area. That's why we have now to find volunteers who would stand at these checkpoints carrying wheelchairs to carry the elderly people or the patients from one side to the other. That's why 52 women so far have had to give birth at checkpoints. 52 women. 1/3 of them lost their children, their babies, because of that. You can imagine the agony of a pregnant woman trying to get to the hospital to give birth and then finding herself prevented from doing so and finding herself obliged to give birth at the checkpoint. Curfews is another example of a very serious problem where places would be put under complete curfew for up to 2 months. And curfew in our case is not like the curfew, you know, in the United States when your parents tell you you have to be back by 8 or 10 or 12. Curfew means you cannot get out of the home day and night for 24 hours. And of course, that has led to very serious interruption of everything. And these are some of the scenes we had in April when we had invasion. The only difference between the previous occupation that was full and this new form of occupation is that previously the army would come walking or in cars. Now they come in tanks, and you cannot even talk to them. And these are some of the scenes of the invasion that happened at that time. Healthcare facilities are terribly affected. And this is a scene of what happened once in Tulkarem in the north, where, as you can see, a tank attacked 2 ambulances. Both of them were carrying patients. What was most insulting to me watching this was that there was a garbage can that you can see in the corner of the picture on the right. The tank crushed the 2 ambulances and then bypassed the garbage can. This is an example of a behavior that is unacceptable and unjustified. The outcome of it was that 121 ambulances have been attacked and damaged. 991 cases were recorded of ambulances prevented from reaching the people who need them. 25 of our colleagues, doctors, nurses, health workers, were killed while they were trying to provide health care or try to provide support to the injured people. 425 were injured. And worse than everything, we were prevented from reaching those who were bleeding sometimes. Like in the case of Subhi Abu Zahra, who was a Palestinian journalist, one out of 8 other journalists who were killed by the Israeli army. He was shot in the thigh, he was bleeding. All he needed is a good medical team and an ambulance, and he would have been saved. But because of prevention of access, because the ambulance could not get to him on time, he bled to death. And several other cases exist like that. The psychological impact of this situation is undescribable. We had many studies done about this, and 93% of the population expressed the view that they feel totally unsafe. About 48% have personally experienced some kind of violence, and 52%, especially children, feel that their parents cannot protect them. This is very bad when children feel that they are totally unprotected, and when they see their families, their father and mother, insulted and humiliated intentionally or sometimes beaten at checkpoints. This can create very serious psychological damage to the child. Of course, there's an example of the distress that people go through. This is the picture of 4 sisters of a boy, Sami Salah, recently shot in Rafah with a shrapnel of a tank bomb, which shattered his head and cut it off from his body. And they saw it. Of course, that leaves them in very bad, terrible distress. Destruction of homes and houses is another example. We see here, we have thousands of houses that have been damaged. The images you see on the left side are the images from Nablus, the old city of Nablus, which was damaged more than once. On the right side, you see a house which is being demolished in Jerusalem, because, as the Israeli police say, people did not have a permit to build a house. Well, how can they have a permit to build a house when the amount of land that is allowed for Palestinians to be used for housing in East Jerusalem, which is occupied, is only 4% of the size of the city? And so on and so forth. These are all different images that maybe for us are simply an image we see and then forget, or maybe remember from time to time. But this image for this girl is something that will stay with her all her life, all her life. And if you want to understand the political and the social behavior of people, we have to also look at the background. We have to understand why they are doing what they are doing. The outcome of this situation, of prevention of economic life, of healthcare, of education, is obvious. We have 75% of the people living below the line of poverty, which is only $2 per capita per day. On average, almost 60% now of the working force are unemployed. And this leaves, of course, a huge amount of population in terrible poverty, and leaves us with huge challenges about how can we support people to survive. The wall is the most recent invention of the policy of occupation. I don't know how many of you have ever seen the images of the new wall that Israel is building in the occupied territories, but they call it a fence. And when you hear a fence, it's something mild. Why are Palestinians so worried about a fence? You have fences between neighbors. There is nothing wrong with that. Well, it's not a fence. This is a wall that is twice as high as Berlin Wall was. It makes Berlin Wall looks like, a toy in comparison. This is a wall that is 8 to 12 meters high, 30 to 100 meters wide. It is 3 times as long and twice as high as Berlin Wall. It is a wall that will extend for 1,000 kilometers. And it is a wall that destroys agriculture and Palestinian lives. Contrary to what some people might think, this wall is not a wall that is being built on the borders. Although we would disagree with the idea of having a wall on the borders, we could still live with that if it had been built on the borders. But the reality is that this wall is being built not on the borders between West Bank, Gaza, and Israel. It is built inside the West Bank. This is how it goes, enclaving very huge amount of Palestinian land and enclaving so many Palestinian communities behind the wall, leaving tens of villages, thousands of people stuck between a wall, which they cannot cross to the West Bank, and the borders with Israel, which they cannot cross to get to Israel. It is something that is unprecedented. Not even Berlin Wall was like that. And it is something that is difficult to live with. This wall comes in phases. Because they managed to build the first phase in Qalqilia, Jenin, and Tul Karim without much protest from the international community, they felt encouraged to increase this wall and make it even deeper, up to 22 kilometers deep inside the West Bank. And this is how it looks like. The blue area here is the part that has already been built, and the red area is the area that they are going to build now. They are in the process of building. And guess what? The wall is not going to be only from the east, from the west, but it will also come from the east. So what we will have is a wall that will extend from the west and from the east, enclaving the Palestinian communities and separating so many Palestinian communities here from the rest of the West Bank, and practically separating and annexing 58% of the land of the West Bank. So this is not a wall that is built for security. This is a wall that is built for annexation. It's a wall that is built for land theft and appropriation. It's a wall that is being built to destroy the physical potential of the establishment of a Palestinian state. And thus, it is a wall that is being built by extremists to destroy our joint hope of having peace between two states. And that's why it should not be allowed to continue. That's why we should stop it, and we should protest it, and we should make it fall exactly like the other wall has fallen. It is a duty to do that if we want to have peace in this area. As I said, this has nothing to do with security. For your knowledge, the total amount of borders, the total length of borders between West Bank, Gaza, and Israel is only 200 kilometers. Here we have a wall that is 1,000 kilometers, and if you include the trenches that are being planned inside, you will be talking about practically 3,500 kilometers of borders. As one Israeli journalist wrote recently, he said 3,500 kilometers to protect borders that are 200 kilometers. The size of this wall, the length of this wall, is exactly the same amount of the distance between Israel and Switzerland. So it looks bad, and it is bad. Inside the cities, what you see here are the images in Jerusalem, separating neighborhoods from each other. The same will be in Ramallah. The same is already in Bethlehem. We have houses that have the sitting room on one side of the wall and the bathroom on the other side of the wall. We have agricultural areas that are separated completely from the farmers. And the worst example is what you see in Qalqilia. In this image, you see the city of Qalqilia, which is 46,000 people in size. This is the city of Qalqilia, already surrounded by a wall that goes around the city from all directions, leaving one entrance, 8 meters entrance, with a gate. And the gate has a key. And the soldiers can shut off the gate whenever they want. They usually shut off the gate at 6 p.m. and reopen it at 6 in the morning. Sometimes they decide to shut off the city for 6 days or 7 days, as has happened recently in the last month. So Qalqilia has become a prison. Practically, this is the largest prison on earth. I was watching recently a film called The Pianist, which many of you have watched, I'm sure. And it's a fantastic movie describing the suffering of people in Warsaw, the Jewish people in Warsaw. But when I was watching it, I couldn't stop myself from thinking, my God, this looks like Qalqilia. And that's probably where you would all agree with what late Edward Said said. We, unfortunately, for us and them, have become the victims of the victims. And there must be, of course, a different approach to this. We are talking also about a very dangerous process here, where Israel has announced on the 2nd of October that all the areas that are enclaved here behind the wall are sort of closed areas. This is a new expression. It's not closed military zones, as they used to say. It's closed areas, and closed areas mean that only Israelis can be there, and Israelis mean not only Israeli citizens, but any person who is entitled to become an Israeli citizen, who is entitled to immigrate, for instance, to Israel. But Palestinians cannot be there without a permit. People cannot be in their homes, in their houses, without a military permit. And to get the military permit, they have to prove to the governing authority, to the Israeli military authority, that they live there. They have to prove that they own the land. They have to give so many certificates to this terrible bureaucracy to get permits to be in their homes. You can imagine the feeling of the people and what results from that. And of course, this wall, in the process of building this wall, a lot of damage has been caused, a lot of agricultural damage. Basically, 42% of the Palestinian agriculture in the West Bank has been destroyed. At least 102,000 trees have been uprooted, mainly olive trees. And the impact, as you can understand, was severe on many aspects of life. This is what I wanted to show you about the reality on the ground. Why? Because frequently we come across propositions, suggestions that seem to be dealing with the situation, but actually deal with actual reality rather than the reality itself. And from there, I want to say that there are certain myths that have evolved and that we should deal with, myths that are not correct. The first myth that unfortunately we have to deal with relates to who is the victim in this conflict. And frequently you would hear a propaganda approach which would say that Israel is the victim and the Palestinians are the aggressors. Well, in my opinion, the Israeli people and the Palestinian people are both victims of occupation, both victims of a wrong policy, both victims of a colonial approach that should not exist in the 21st century. The reality is that Israel is not threatened. Israel is the largest, probably fourth or fifth military power in the world. It owns 200 nuclear heads. It has all forms of weapons of mass destruction. And what do Palestinians have? A few thousand policemen with some light guns. They're practically very, very, very weak in comparison to Israel. So the threat is not there. The threat is practically to peace. The threat is to the future of both people. But we cannot accept this approach, this myth that tries to say it is again the weak David against the mighty Goliath. No, in this case, Israel is the mighty Goliath against the Palestinian David, because Israel is occupying the Palestinian people. Frequently, you would hear a second myth, which is that this is a situation of war. Well, it is not war, because there are no two armies here fighting with each other. And violence, which is terrible, which must be stopped from all sides, violence that is causing harm to both people, can be stopped and should be stopped. But violence is the symptom of the disease. And anybody who deals with proper medicine, I think Dr. Max Pepper here would agree with me, would know that if you want to treat a patient, you do not concentrate on the symptom, treat the cause of the disease. And the cause of violence in this case has been and still is oppression and occupation. Unless we remove the cause, we cannot get really to true and lasting security for everybody. The third myth that Sharon has proposed and unfortunately convinced so many Israelis with was that there is and there can be a military solution to the conflict. Well, life has shown that this is a true myth, because Sharon said he will crack down the intifada, the uprising, in 100 days. He's been in government for 100 days and 1,000 days more, and he cracked nothing. And he will not be able to, because he doesn't understand the simple fact, which is, in this case, you can oppress the Palestinians, you can jail them, you can kill many of them, you can put them in ghettos, but you cannot break their will. Because this is what remained for us to survive. The will and the strong belief that we should be dignified. A fourth myth that prevailed is that this is simply a negotiating dispute between two sides. And if you just bring them to the table of negotiations and have them sit and have good negotiation techniques and maybe some experts who could help them negotiate properly, you can achieve a solution of the problem. Well, actually, it's not the case. We negotiated a lot. I sometimes joke with some of our colleagues, some of the Palestinian officials in the authority, and I say, you have made your slogan, negotiations till death. And what has happened is really a very strange situation where many diplomats, many politicians have tried to substitute the solution of the problem with a virtual solution of the issue. In my opinion, during the last 10 years, many politicians started worshiping what they call the peace process, forgetting that the peace process is an instrument to achieve peace. And if there is something that should be worshipped, it's peace, not the process. And the process cannot be used as a substitute to the goal and to the target in this case. And that's why, thank you. And that's why I think we should look at this conflict as it is. It is a power struggle between those who want to impose certain reality on the ground and those who want simply to achieve independence and freedom. And like in the case of South Africa, like in the case of Yugoslavia, like in the case of the Bosnia, you have two sides. One is very powerful and one is much weaker in material terms. And the solution cannot be found without external international intervention in this conflict by fixing and repairing this very terrible balance in power. And that's the only way to achieve a solution. It's the only way, and the reference should not be what the two sides agree about. The reference should be international law and international resolutions, because what we need here is not just a piece of paper that is signed by two leaders. One of them is engaged practically in a prison, is put in prison. What we need here is an agreement, is peace that can last for both people. And the last myth I want to speak about is this myth that Israel is the only democracy in the barbaric Middle East. And Israel is the only, and can be the only democracy in the region. Well, sorry, this is not true. First of all, the issue of democracy in Israel has to be challenged. And second, we insist to become also a democracy in the Middle East as Palestinians. And in my opinion, there are three very basic and important principles that must be followed for a true vision to end this conflict and to get us out of this situation. The first principle that I believe in completely, that Edward Said believed in, that Haidar Abd al-Shafi believed in, who led our negotiating team in Madrid before he was bypassed in Oslo. That principle is that democracy has become a precondition to end this conflict, a precondition to have peace. Look at history. Let's look at the history of Europe. Only when peace was concluded between democracies, it would last and it would survive. And democracy in Palestine means free democratic elections, means proper governance, means ending any form of corruption, any form of incompetence, allowing people to choose. And democracy means agreements that would be negotiated between two equal parts, two sides that are empowered through election to represent their people. Peace can last if an agreement is reached through equal negotiations between two sides and not an agreement that is imposed because of power balance from one side on the other. That is the main difference between what we had so far and what can we have. And as much as the Israelis have the right to ratify any agreement in the parliament, in the Knesset, it is Palestinian right also to have elected parliament representing all Palestinians and also ratifying any agreement. Only then we can speak about something that can last. But we believe that democracy in Palestine, in this case, cannot be achieved only through goodwill and only through asking for it. As we all know, democracy has to be obtained. And that's why we have formed this new initiative, the Palestinian National Initiative, because we want a political force that would struggle for democratization, true democratization of the Palestinian entity. We want a force that could give people hope, that could give people, help people, empower people with the feeling of confidence, self-reliance, and hope that something can be achieved. The second major principle that would lead to a resolution is a serious international presence on the ground. We cannot have free democratic elections in Palestine unless we do have international presence on the ground. And maybe elections can be an entry point where international presence could be achieved, elections could be conducted, and then have a true representative government that could negotiate a final agreement in accordance to international law. This is a way that people would accept, and not some kind of secret negotiations here and there to try to find an agreement behind the backs of the people who have suffered so much and who want to have a solution so much. An international presence is a must, and we must have it if we want not only to provide protection and security, but also if we want to find a true solution to this problem. Only then, when the Israelis are ready and mature to accept Palestinians as equal human beings, that we can have a solution. Believe me, Israel is facing lots of problems, very serious problems. They don't talk about that in the press. But Israel is passing through its most vicious and difficult economic crisis. They've lost $23 billion because of the ongoing conflict. They have now strikes everywhere. They also have lost people. And they don't have a security solution. And the most important thing is that there is a demographic challenge there. Maybe Israel has managed to establish geopolitical new facts on the ground that we couldn't stop by building all these settlements. But on the other hand, the Palestinians have established demographic facts on the ground that Israel cannot ignore. The reality is that all these settlements could not prevent the Palestinians from becoming equal in numbers almost now to the number of Jewish Israelis in the land of Palestine. And the question here to Israel is what it wants for its future. It was said before, I remember this thing being said a lot during the first Intifada, and then forgotten, that Israel cannot hold more than two of three things. Either it is a democratic state and a Jewish state, or it is a democratic state with occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, or it's a state with occupation. These three things cannot be held together. If Israel wants to be Jewish and keep the occupied territories, then it is becoming an apartheid. And an apartheid can never be a democracy. What we have on the ground now is an apartheid system. If Israel wants to be democratic and keep the occupied territories, that's also fair enough. We will have a binational state in which Palestinians and Israelis will have equal rights. It's fine with us, but it would mean that Israel is not a Jewish state. Israel would be, or Palestine will be, or Israel-Palestine, as Gaddafi wanted to call it. This would be an entity that is Palestinian and Jewish at the same time. So it's their choice. If they want Israel to be a democracy and a Jewish state, they have to give up the occupied territories. And they have to accept that Palestine can prevail and can live as an independent state. There is no other way. Israel cannot have, they could have 400 nuclear bombs, more than 200. They can have an additional 5,000 tanks from taxpayers' money, your money, the American taxpayers' money. They can have an additional army maybe, but this will not change the reality on the ground. This will not change any of these options. And if there are Israeli ministers who still dream about transfer, then they are, in my opinion, deadly mistaken. As for us, Palestinians, I can promise you with one thing. Nothing is going to break our will. We will steadfast and we will stay. We will not leave. We've learned from the terrible experience of 1948. And all this oppression, as I hope for our people, all this oppression and suppression will not, I hope, will not lead us to hatred. No, it should lead us to something else, to more insistence on having our dignity and freedom. We will never give up our right for freedom and dignity. We are struggling not for revenge, no. We're struggling simply for justice and dignity. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I hope I will welcome you someday as President of the Prime Minister. Thank you. Palestine, please. For the stop to the questions. Dr. Barghouti has agreed to answer questions briefly. I think so that people understand it is now 5:15, and I think that at 5:40 to provide a limit, we will cease. So I will not have closed anybody off, but people understand we'll do it by time. And there are two microphones, one on the right and one on the left. I'll start on that side, and I'll alternate between microphones, and at 5:40, we will end, and you can talk with Dr. Barghouti in person. We will have a reception here in the Crown Center following this event, which you're also invited to. Microphone on my right.
Dr. Barghouti, is it on? Check. Okay. Dr. Barghouti, thanks so much for coming. I had a question. Many people are trying to put economic pressure on the state of Israel to end the occupation by getting their schools and other institutions to divest from Israel and corporations that are benefiting from the Israeli occupation. I'm wondering from you, do you think that this can be a good and effective strategy on the part of activists in the United States who are trying to work in solidarity with the Palestinian cause for freedom?
Shall I take one question at a time, or maybe take three questions together? What do you prefer?
Okay, we'll do three at a time. There's one, he's writing them down, and then he's going to answer three, so we'll alternate back and forth. Keep the questions short so he can make a note on the my left. On the microphone over there. Your question.
Doctor, just wanted to thank you for being here. Appreciate your presence. As you and probably many others in the room know, the U.S., much like Israel, is now a military power occupying a foreign nation in the Middle East, Iraq. And I was wondering if you could compare those at all or give your thoughts on the U.S. occupation of that country and what's happening there. Thanks.
And question.
I was interested to know what you think about right of return and a one-state versus two-state solution, whereas if right of return would be necessary in a two-state solution and how that would then impact whether the Jewish state would then stay a Jewish state. So if that is really, I think you know what I'm saying. So right of return in one versus two states. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. I'll try to answer these questions. First of all, let me relate to something I should have told you about before, which is that there are a number of websites that you should look at if you wish to. This is the initiative website. If you like to write to us or ask questions or get information. And I will alternate. There is another website, which is the Palestine Monitor, which has lots of information about the situation. So I'll keep putting them on and off, and you can use that. Now, regarding the first question about boycott, as I understand, whether it's a strategy or a good strategy or not, I cannot tell you what is a proper strategy in the United States. I can tell you what I think would be useful to us, what you can do to help the Palestinians and the cause of justice in this region. I think, first of all, what we need from you is to give the right information, to get through, to break this taboo or this kind of blackout on the situation by bringing the information to the attention of people and try to make some kind of breakthroughs through the media. Second, there has to be pressure on Israel because of its violation of human rights, because of the policy of apartheid. If boycott is a useful strategy, you can use it. In the case of Europe, they are now discussing the fact that Israel is boycotting lots of European diplomats. And they are thinking of returning that by doing the same. There is a lot of talk in Europe now about the fact that Israel is using the privileges that it got as a state in terms of exporting goods to Europe to produce and export settlement products also in Europe. So these are agreements that can be, of course, challenged, and boycott is one of the questions. But I cannot tell you what is the best tactic in this situation in the United States, given this serious lack of information about the reality on the ground. And I think you should be careful not to allow those who try to show as if Israel is the victim to consolidate this understanding of victimization. It is very important to be careful about that. I would urge you to come to Palestine. We have wonderful people who came to Palestine, like Rachel Corey and Thomas Handel and so many other people from ISM and from Grassroots International for the Protection of the Palestinian People. Believe me, nothing is more is so useful as much as being there and seeing things by yourself. What I've described to you is only a little thing in comparison to what you can see and gain and understand if you just happen to be there for a couple of days. And we need you to struggle against these checkpoints. We need you because of the issue of the wall. So any number of people who could come and volunteer also and help us professionally, you're most welcome. And of course, we would like those who can help and provide material support to help us with providing medical care, employment for those, especially in the area of the wall. We are now starting a huge campaign of family adoption and support to those who are behind the wall, because we do understand that the main goal of the wall is to force people to leave their homes and their villages. To helping them to stay there is the most important goal and would be the most important instrument in defeating the Israeli purpose. And we want you to let people know about the initiative, the Palestinian National Initiative, because it is very important that people start to see that there is a different image and face of Palestinians rather than the two stereotypes that Israel tries to consolidate in their propaganda by saying that Palestinians can only be either corrupt bureaucrats or extreme fundamentalists. It's very important to break that stereotype as well. The question about Iraq, of course, you know our positions regarding the occupation of Iraq. We do not think that occupation is good for any country, not even the United States. And one American official once asked me about the situation there, and I said, "You want to hear my frank opinion? You're sure?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Fine. You are not designed to be a colonial power. You are not designed to be an occupying power, so you better get out of there." And I believe that what is happening there could deteriorate much more. The right thing to do is to give the Iraqi people the right to choose, to have a free democratic government, to have free democratic elections, bring the United Nations there. It's not good for the Americans to be losing people there too. This is becoming a disaster that is increasing with time. That's why I think the Iraqi people are entitled to self-determination and not to a government that is imposed on them as well. Regarding the right of return, this is the most difficult issue, of course, in this conflict. But it is the root of the Palestinian cause. It is the root of the conflict itself. I personally believe that the right of return is an individual right that cannot be negated by anybody. Nobody can sign it off. But the right of return is also approved by international community through UN resolutions. That doesn't mean that it cannot be negotiated. It doesn't mean that creative solutions could not be found. It is possible. But all depends on the available solution. It is not right to expect that Palestinians will simply give up the right of return in exchange with nothing. And to approach the matter as if this is the problem is, in my opinion, a mistake. The question relates to whether we will become a binational state, or two states, or occupation will continue. We need to know what is the outcome, and that's why I do not agree with those who separate the issue of refugees from all the rest of the issues. It's a mistake. It's a mistake for everybody. It can be negotiated, a creative solution can be found, but everything depends on the context. I, at the same time, understand those who come and say, how could Israel survive? Of course, if all Palestinian refugees come back to Israel, there will be no Israel, it's clear. Well, but you cannot also expect Palestinians to give up the right of refugees now and create a new problem of refugees in the wall, near the wall, with 600,000 people more becoming refugees. That's why I do not think that it is correct to separate this issue from the rest. Whether to have a two-state solution or a binational state. It's not just a matter of academic and intellectual, exercise. If you follow an intellectual analysis, the natural thing is to have binational state. It's easier. The problem with that is that we've struggled so hard for 40 years to make the world accept our right for statehood, for an independent state. We cannot just give it up. And at the same time, we are not sure. I personally do not want to see my daughter and the other children in Palestine live through a long, prolonged stage of apartheid. Because if you say, I want to give now the issue of the statehood and have a binational state, then what would you do during the coming 30 or 40 years? When will we have apartheid system on the ground? That's why I say It's a difficult question. It's a natural, logical thinking, as Edward Said did say, that if you would not allow us to have an independent, true, real, sovereign state, then okay, we go for binational state. I agree with that. In my opinion, the immediate political goal should be to demand ending occupation and allowing Palestinians to have an independent sovereign state. But if that does not become possible, and the state becomes only simply clusters of ghettos as a substitute to real state, then binational state is a fallback position for the Palestinians that we have to stick to.
Start on the left.
I have two questions, one for Dr. Barghouti and one for the President of Hampshire. To Dr. Barghouti, I noticed that nowhere in your speech did you mention the words terrorist or suicide bomber. And I just wanted to ask why you don't include any pictures of Israeli children who have been killed, or give any reason as to the current strictness of the occupation as a result of the terrorist abominations of the Palestinian people. And to the President, I wonder why you include only one side of a conflict. And I ask if that's beneficial to your students at this college to not present the speaker with any opposition.
Shall we take two more questions?
Let's do there were two questions. Let's do that right now, and then we'll go to the side.
Okay. Well, I did not show you images of suicide bombing because you see a lot of them on American TV. I wanted to show you, no, please come in. I wanted to show you what you don't see. And by no means I agree with suicide bombing. I have personally been engaged in trying to have ceasefire 3 times. And I have personally been engaged with many other people in Palestine to try to have a code of ethics where no civilians would be attacked ever, and where we would not really attack even targets inside Israel. But unfortunately, those who undermined these agreements were the Israeli government. I want to remind you that I was asked the same question in Boston yesterday, and in Boston University. And one person asked about suicide bombers and so on. And I want to remind you of the fact that for 7 years, since 1993 till the year 2000, with the exception of a very short period of time, Palestinians abstained from any form of struggle, not even peaceful struggle. They were waiting for Oslo agreements to be implemented, regardless of the fact that many of them, like me, did not agree with them. But we were waiting for them to be implemented, and this did not happen. I want to remind you that the first terrorist suicide attack was the one done by Baruch Goldstein inside the Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron. Before that, there wasn't a single Palestinian suicide bombing. So it's something that I do not agree with.
There were no attacks on Jews in 1948 when Israel became a state?
Something that I do not agree with, something that I wish would disappear from this conflict. But as I said, the symptom is violence, the cause is occupation.
In reference to your question to me, first, this is a lecture, it is not a panel, but I would welcome the counterpart to Dr. Barghouti making the case or describing the side from Israel. I think it would be beneficial and important to the community. So all I can say is that I agree with you that all sides are presented. I would remind you, perhaps you're enrolled, there is a course being offered now by Vice President Dean of the Faculty of Hampshire College focusing on Palestine and Israel and exploring all of these and other questions that come up in this issue. So the importance of exploring the complexity of the case is, I think, exactly why we're here, and I would support your goal of having other sides presented as well. This side.
Dr. Barghouti, thank you. You actually spontaneously answered my question, so I'll take just a moment to make a couple announcements. I was a volunteer with the International Solidarity Movement. I'm glad to hear that you think that we do something useful. I was going to ask whether or not you thought it was
More
a good
than
organization.
useful.
Thank you.
Something heroic and wonderful.
Thank you. So if there are people in the audience who are interested in possibly working with the ISM, I'm going to stand by the water fountains and come talk to me after this. And the second thing is that some recent ISM volunteers and other journalists are going to be giving a presentation at Amherst College on Saturday the 15th at 5 p.m. in Converse Hall.
I'll add 2 more minutes to the question and answer after that commercial break. But please try to keep this to questions. So it was an important and appropriate comment, and I'm glad he made it. But question here, question over here, and then a question back there. We'll try to get 3 questions on the docket for Dr. Barghouti to respond to.
Your speech is titled Civil Society and Prospect for Peace in Middle East. Would you define what you mean by civil society? I mean, what infrastructure do you have? I mean, you can mobilize people in Ramallah, but how do you reach people in Gaza? And how do you negotiate your ways through, like, various fraction? I mean, in terms like how you deal with the state represented in the occupied forces and the Palestinian Authority, and also like remaining in the same times relatively autonomous or independent.
I recently learned of the Geneva Initiative, that's citizen diplomacy, Israelis and Palestinians coming up with a start of a blueprint for peace. Could you comment on that? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Israeli, so maybe I'm the other side. All my heart is just for Palestine. I think the only way for Israeli to be heard is by free Palestine. And I want to say that I'm not sure you have to put both sides here in academia, because when you have oppressor and oppressed, I think academia should let more the oppressed to speak, because CNN and New York Times let the oppressor to speak. And for me, as Israeli who live in New York, it's such a pleasure to see so many people who really support our mutual goal to free Palestine. And one more thing, I think that as Israel, you feel the full responsibility to dedicate his life for the freedom of Palestine. I think Americans should do the same, because Israel cannot continue the occupation without the full support of America. So this responsibility of America should be heard very strongly. And without them, I think if they would put half, 1/10 of the money they put in the war of Iraq to create free Palestine, we had the real first democracy in the Middle East, because Israel is not a democracy when 3.5 million people live under occupation. Thank you.
Okay, I've got 2 questions here. One is about civil society. I should have maybe told you more about civil society. We just don't have much time. But I want to say maybe 2 or 3 things that can help you understand the situation. First of all, we really have very vibrant civil society in Palestine. And I think maybe some Palestinian leaders thought that when the authority was established, they would simply recreate as another form of one of the Arab regimes with an autocratic system. And we simply showed them that this is impossible. And there was a lot of struggle for the rule of law, a lot of struggle for the right of NGOs, for instance, to act and work. And we are still going on. There are lots of tendencies that want to suppress civil society, but we will not allow that. The civil society in Palestine evolved a lot because of occupation too, since we had to survive and we had to rely on ourselves. And during the 70s and the 80s, The most beautiful side of the Palestinian struggle, which is frequently ignored, unfortunately, is this civil nonviolent resistance, which ended up with the creation of so many committees and structures, medical relief committees, agricultural committees, women groups, popular committees. This was a society that realized in 1978, after Egypt concluded the Camp David Accords with Israel, that it cannot keep waiting for the help to come from outside, and it has to practice two things: self-reliance and self-organization. And that was the beginning of the first uprising. It started not in 88, it started in in my opinion, 79. And I have the honor to be one of those who were there and participated in this process of building civil society, which became more ambitious and does not want only to have a free country, but also a democratic country. NGOs are part of this, professional unions, trade unions, women groups, political parties. It's a wide range of structures. But just to give you an idea, up till now, and regardless of great financial difficulty, and regardless of the fact that most of the support internationally goes to the Palestinian Authority, not to NGOs, NGOs are still in charge of 60% of primary health care in Palestine. They are in charge of 90% of care for disabled people and around 100% of preschool education. They are, of course, in charge of democracy programs and so many other civil society activities and organizations. So it's a strong civil society that has a future and hopefully has a chance to help building a democratic state. We are very much engaged now in advocating free democratic elections and in advocating true reform that responds to the needs of the community and society in general. Regarding the Geneva discussions, I have two opinions about this. One opinion is that, okay, if this is something that could help break this taboo or this myth in Israel that there is no Palestinian partner, so fine. I hope it will work in changing the minds of the people in Israel and will help in promoting the issue of peace. On the other side, I see the same old faces negotiating without having the mandate to do that. It's the same crowd. We were not consulted, we were not discussed. I mean, I'm not talking about myself, I mean the people. They feel completely out of the picture. And it is unequal discussion because from one side, regardless of the declaration that this is unofficial, it's the official Palestinian Authority representatives negotiating with an unofficial Israeli side. And we could have problems with that. We had the same in Oslo, where one side's concessions are recorded, the other side's concessions mean nothing. And they are not accepted. So that's why I see there is a serious imbalance there. My worry is that sometimes some of these things end up dealing with what we call virtual reality rather than the reality itself. And my duty is to bring you to reality. And our duty together is to get this reality to a true solution, because we are sick and tired of virtual stuff. It's time to do the real thing. Real negotiations and real solution. But if this will help the peace camp in Israel, wonderful. We would support that. Thank you.
Okay, these three, I would ask you to keep crisp and short questions, please. I would like to make one comment about the issue of sides. I think you do have to represent many sides, but I chose my words carefully. There are many counterparts to Dr. Barghouti, both in Palestine and Israel, and I would love to have those. You would find much that overlapped, but there would be differences, and we would learn from those differences as well as the commonalities of those who seek the kind of peace that Dr. Barghouti seeks, and there are many camps and others who feel that way. Okay, the question on the left.
I'm wondering if you could speak to the role of media and specifically textbooks put out by the Palestinian Authority and how that affects what you're referring to as the reality on the ground.
Yes, on the right.
when the Barak government was in power in Israel, the sides came the closest to a solution. And there were proposals made which seemed to meet, to go a long way toward meeting the demands of the Palestinian side. And many people are convinced that the election of Sharon was directly a result of the fact that Arafat rejected those proposals and did not make any counter proposals. Do you think that there was perhaps that was a mistake on Arafat's part, that they should have continued the dialogue with Barak, which would have been much more likely to result in something positive than what they're getting now from Sharon?
Next question, last question.
Dr. Barghouti, you've made a very important point which I think deserves greater emphasis, and that is that only when two democracies negotiate, the Israeli democracy, as imperfect as it is, but a nascent Palestinian democracy, that only when these two democracies negotiate can true peace be achieved. In this light, do you think, and how does the Palestine Initiative, for example, hope to deal with Arafat, who is essentially the exclusive authority, and also the separate militias who act independently, like Hamas, Hezbollah, and even the Tansim? How do you propose to deal with these initiatives, with these militias that have managed to scuttle peace programs in the past?
Okay. The nice questions come at the end. Okay. I think your first question was about the media and textbooks. I think you could come up with something better than that, because this has been a propaganda stuff, you know, which claims it goes around the issue of trying to make Israel look like the victim and Palestinians are the aggressors. Yesterday I heard a student in Boston telling me, you did not want a Palestinian state. You refused a Palestinian state. I say, we are saying we accept a Palestinian state. There was a decision made by the Palestinian National Council to accept a Palestinian state, and you claim that we did not accept a Palestinian state. Believe me, these kinds of arguments come out of a strong feeling, in my opinion, of guilt. Guilt, because there is obviously a situation of oppression here. You only have to be blind not to see it. And the issue of textbooks is not a true issue. I am ready to offer something, if you wish. Choose 2 students, or 3 if you like, and have them come to Palestine. I will personally assist them in looking through all the Palestinian textbooks and some Israeli textbooks. And we will work together and see where is the problem. You will notice that if there is racism, it is not in the Palestinian textbooks. So this is not an argument that I think is correct. It's something that propaganda has used in a wrong way, simply to show that the Palestinians in this conflict are not victims but aggressors. Second, I can give you a whole book of statements made by Israeli ministers, now ministers, saying that all Palestinians should be transferred, and that Palestinians are not human beings, and so on. So we can go into this for a long time. I hope that you will give yourself a chance one day to just try to see the reality from the other side. The second question about Barak's offer is another argument that has been used to justify the Israeli attack on the Palestinian people. Whether Arafat should have accepted it? No, he couldn't, and he shouldn't have. And if he did, I would have criticized him. I'll tell you why. Because Barak's offer was not about a statehood. It was not about a real state. I have the map. I can bring it to you and show it to you. Barak offered only something like 78% of the West Bank and not 93% or 94% as they say. Barak offered no sovereignty in Jerusalem. All he offered is only some municipality control over some neighborhoods, but no real sovereignty in East Jerusalem. Barak wanted Palestinians to give up the issue of refugees, to close off completely the file in exchange for a state that would look like 4 clusters of Pantostans unrelated to each other. And this was not an offer that could make peace. And I believe that what Israel must rethink is 3 principles that have been there all the time. Raja Shehadeh spoke about them a lot in his different books, where whether it was Barak or Sharon, they stick to these principles. And these principles are that a Palestinian entity should never have borders. It should always be surrounded by the Israeli army and state. And that does not mean that the Palestinian entity would actually be sovereign. We are not talking here about a real state. The other aspect is that any Palestinian entity should not prevent Israel from continuing to build facts on the ground. And that is the reason, the surprising reason, why after Oslo was signed, Israel created 102 new settlements on the ground. And the third condition that they've put is that any Palestinian authority should only have functional authority and not sovereign authority. I say, if the solution is 2 states, then a Palestinian state must be a true state. I'm ready to sign tomorrow on an agreement that says that the Palestinian state will be totally demilitarized. We don't need an army. 1 army less in this world would be better. But it should have borders. It should control its borders. We should decide who would enter our state and who would not an Israeli officer sitting on the borders. Barak was the main principal person responsible for bringing Sharon to the government. And if there is a mistake that was done here, it was the mistake of Barak in this particular case. Palestinians, by the way, continued to negotiate with Barak after Camp David failed. They met in Taba and they made progress in negotiations. But these agreements that were made in Taba, much of which has been presented in Geneva, were never approved or accepted by Barak. So I'm worried, I'm afraid that what you have been exposed to is simply a process of misleading, where you've been misled about the reality of what really happened in Camp David. I think reading some of the articles that were written by Rob Morley, who attended the negotiations, would be very useful in exposing the reality of what happened there. About Palestinian National Initiative and Mr. Arafat, we say that Mr. Arafat has the right to run in elections as much as we all have the right to run. And it wouldn't be up to Israel or any other country to decide who would lead the Palestinians. And he was elected in 1996. His term is over. He should be exposed to elections. And we have the right to compete in these elections, and the Palestinian people have the right to choose through a democratic, clear process of elections. Now, I know that the game, Arafat was very, very much liked in 1993 and 94. By the way, in 1994, I wrote an article personally in Wall Street Journal. You can look at it if you want. It was published in, I think, in 26th of August, 1994. In that article, I criticized, the title was very unpopular. I mean, it was dangerous even. I said, "Aid to Arafat hurts ordinary Palestinians," in which I described the lack of attention from the side of those who supported Oslo to the issue of democracy in Palestine. And I said that this process But at that time, nobody cared about it. Everybody wanted to legitimize Oslo, and Arafat was a hero for the United States and for Israel because he signed. He became an enemy when he refused to sign again. And I think there was a process of personal delegitimization and even character assassination that is used now to undermine the whole Palestinian people. And this is incorrect. I think democracy means he has the right to run, we have the right to run. I believe in our people. Thank you.